So the High Empire, as we were just talking about with the early empire, family line was how they selected their rulers. So you had the Julio-Claudians, then you had the Flavians. Well, at the end of the Flavian period, you once again had another bad emperor. So this leaves the people of the Senate to consider, how are we picking these emperors? And they decide the family line maybe isn't your best bet because there's no way to guarantee quality there. There's no way to really know if the next person's going to be valid or not. So they decide to go with a selection method. The Senate, in a sense, picks Nerva, who we won't really talk about, but again, he's the first that's selected. And then Nerva is given the task of picking someone as his successor, right? Who will come after him if he's assassinated or he dies or whatever. So this idea of picking the person you want to rule after you now becomes the common Roman practice. In Nerva, you'll notice picks Trajan, that we will talk more about. They believed that, this way you could have people that perhaps had some government background or some military background, who had some experience. And were just generally known to be good people who had the ability to understand rulership, right, in a real way. It also basically was a way of discouraging assassination, because if you kill Nerva, you've already got Trajan coming next. So, this idea that it's not really all that easy to kill off the emperor and get the turnover that you might want, right? So there's a couple different reasons why this system was thought to be good. And it works pretty well, hence we actually call this era the era of the good emperors. This is still also, by the way, the Pax Romana. It still lasts through this period. So what Augustus put into place with the Pax Romana is still continuing on during the High Empire as well. And Trajan, it's good to go ahead and start looking at him, because who does he choose to look like in his portrait statue? Augustus. So it's proof that Augustus really does have an immense hold over the psyches or the minds, right, of a lot of Romans. Augustus is often celebrated as like the best emperor out there, so other emperors want to emulate him or be like him. Trajan, of course, showing us basically through the costuming, the posing, the posturing, everything, he's really just trying to say, I'm like Augustus. So the Augustan way, it was something that was still very much part of how Romans were thinking about rulership. And again, the Pax Romana was still in effect, so people were satisfied, people were peaceful. They were pretty happy, right? They just needed to have a leadership system that worked, hence the selection method that leads to the good emperors. So Trajan here, sort of mimicking Augustus. We can talk amongst ourselves about whether it works or not, right? But to me, this is like, seeing somebody with a certain fashion on and then you wearing it and going, woo, though, doesn't look good on me, right? So we can argue, does Trajan pull it off? How does he wear it? That's debatable. But we get the point of what he's trying to do with what he's signaling to us, right, as the viewer. And that's why I mentioned to you that most Roman art is propaganda. It's about what it makes you think about. Trajan's signature monument is Trajan's Column. It's really the only one you see of its kind. It's very unique. And it was in the Forum. As I mentioned before, the Forum was a place where you could see a lot of these signature monuments. I'm not going to dive into the Forum and go too far into that discussion beyond this point, but again, it's something, if you're really into Rome, you may want to do some more research on your own end to understand the Forum and its usage. Because again, a lot of temples and monuments and different things were located in the Roman Forum. What is on this column? It celebrates Trajan's battle against the Dacians, the Dacian people. And Rome, as we were talking about, they're imperialists, right? They're pulling other people, right, into the Roman way of life, and the Dacians were going to be one of the people that they conquered under Trajan's rulership. Now, one of the reasons we think Nerva picked Trajan was because he had been a military commander, and he understood the military side of things. He also had been a governor and governed various areas in Germania, so he understood that as well. So, why pick him? He understands these things. So again, he's thinking of like what commemorates him, what's he want to be proud of, and he's picking this battle. The Dacian people, they were living in the region of like Eastern Europe that we would say is Hungary, the area of Hungary, the Budapest area, So if you're into geography and want to look on a map, that's where the Dacians were located. And on the bottom, you'll notice there's this larger figure that kind of almost seems like it's rising up on the bottom section of the column. That was actually representing the river Pest, kind of rising up, right? And a lot of people try to say it's like it's welcoming the Romans in, like, please conquer us, we don't mind, right? So the area of Hungary, right, the Budapest region, is where the Dacians were located. Why a column? We think it was a way to have a unique form that told a continuous narrative. If you remember talking about this idea of continuous narrative back with like the Book of the Dead and such, this idea of telling a story that kind of continues, right? We'll talk about this more when we get to look at the medieval manuscripts as well. But this idea that it almost spools out, like a movie, and you're following along, right, all the different parts, right, of the narrative. It's very unique. It tells a continuous story. We also think it was a way of suggesting that Trajan was very educated, because scrolls were how they kept their information. There were no books yet at this time. So the idea of like a book with a spine down the middle and pages you flip through, Greeks didn't have those, Romans didn't have those. They're actually a medieval invention, the codex as we call it. So the scroll was how they kept their information. Originally, on either side of the column, there were two different libraries. That as you went up the different levels, you could look out of the staircase windows and see the column. So a lot of people ask me, well, how would you read this thing from the ground? I'm like, well, they didn't. They would go up each floor in the library, look out the window, and then they could look at different parts of the narrative. The libraries are also an interesting choice to place next to the columns because it suggests, again, scrolls, education, information, language, right? That kind of, thing. So what Trajan was doing was even more complicated. He was saying, I'm a military commander, I'm hard, I can fight, I can win, but I'm also a very educated man as well. He was trying to kind of mix those two things together in his signature monument. So I think he was trying to say I'm not one-dimensional. I have a lot of things about me that I want people to understand, that I'm not just a tough, and I'm not just this educated guy reading scrolls. I'm both of these things. So it's an intriguing monument, I think, for that reason. On top of the column, originally would have been a statue of Trajan. Today it's actually St. Peter. Once the Christians were coming in and Christianizing Rome, they replaced it with a statue of St. Peter. In the bottom of the monument actually was the mausoleum for Trajan and his wife's ashes. So it actually is where his final resting place was, so it was used in that way as well. So very, very unique, interesting monument, Trajan's column. Trajan had picked Hadrian as his successor. And Hadrian is a very interesting character in Roman imperial history also. Hadrian was actually not a local Italian, as we'd say, right? He was a Spaniard. And this was interesting because really most emperors up until now had been patrician, Italian, Mediterranean people. So I bring this up because I want you to think about the fact that they're expanding their idea of Rome and what it means to be Roman into the places that they're conquering. This will continue into the late empire as well, where they'll have people from Africa as emperors, again, Spaniards, whatnot, ruling. Hadrian was also known for his love of Greek art. And you can even see this in his hairstyle. If you go back and look at like Critios Boy and such, he's got like kind of this little Greek hairstyle. And he's also noted for starting the idea of beards on emperors. Where Augustus, you'll notice he has a very smooth baby face. Hadrian is often credited as the one who started the beard trend, and you'll notice by the end of this time period it gets a little out of control. So it's fun to think about that. But he loved all things Greek. He loved the culture of Greece. He loved the, sort of the architecture of Greece. And many people think this led to influence his signature monument, which was the Pantheon. Now, normally, as I mentioned, emperors usually created something that was like about peace or prosperity or like, look how tough I am. What Hadrian's monument did was give a place to the Romans for worship. It was a very unique idea of worship because the Pantheon, pan, all, theon, the gods, right, theistic. This was a place to worship all the gods. We talked about the Parthenon, and I had mentioned that Parthenos meant virgin, so that's why Parthenon. Pantheon, all the gods. That's why it's pantheon. So if you know your language, you should never mix them up, right? You know what it means. So the pantheon, this is the place for him that he gave to the people in a sense to worship all the gods. Now go back and think about what I'd said about the Greeks and their gods. You build one temple for one god. You don't build a temple for all the gods. So a Greek would be appalled by this. What I think Hadrian would have said is, well, why not? It's efficient. It's your one-stop shop for all your god needs. It's like the Walmart, right? So it kind of plays a different way. Romans were very different about their needs, even when it came to religion. What I also think is intriguing about it is notice it looks very traditional from the front. It kind of looks like your traditional temple. But if you see it from the air, you'll notice it's this giant dome structure. This is achieved through the use of concrete, which again is a Roman invention. Concrete is able to be shaped and molded. You can use molds and such to make these open vaulted spaces. This is something you can't do with cut stone. It's just not possible. So concrete was very revolutionary in what it could achieve, and the Romans definitely leveraged that in many, many ways. Now, concrete, by the way, is lost during the medieval period. It has to be reinvented again. So, again, something to consider is that the Romans invent this material and really just push it to all its, sort of lengths, what they can do with it. So I love that if you look at it from the front, it looks very traditional, like a traditional Greek temple. And then if you're looking at it from the back, you're like, oh, hold up. This is really unique and really, really different with this huge, right, dome mass. You go inside and you see what was trying to be achieved here. Now, on the right, you have a much later painting of the interior of the Pantheon by the artist Panini. This is from the 1800s. When a lot of Europeans were traveling to Rome on the Grand Tours, it was called, and doing veduta paintings or view paintings. They're almost like postcards. And I'm showing you the painting because it just helps you get a sense of the interior. Notice that when you take a photograph, like the one on the left, it's hard to give an overall view of the space because it's circular, so you just get this fisheye effect. So I think the painting kind of helps you think about the space, what it looks like. So notice you have this concrete dome. You have the coffering effect, which is sort of this decorative squaring, you'll notice. But if you really think about the practicality, it's removing the concrete or removing the mass to make the dome lighter. So it looks pretty, but it's also pretty practical as far as design is concerned. And in the middle, you have the oculus, the opening, which they would have said was like the eye of the gods, like looking down on you, right? Yes, it rains through there. Yes, the sun shines through there. The floor is slanted a bit so the water could run off. So that's how they handled that problem. And you'll notice around the edges you have the various statues representing the gods. So they're all sort of, placed in their little niches. And during the time, you would come in and you'd go find the god you wanted to worship. Or maybe you want to worship more than one god while you were there. So I jokingly say it's your one-stop shop for all your god needs. That's pretty true. So this space was meant to be a space for all the gods. Rather than having to go to each individual temple, you could take care of everything for your worship in that place. Again, for the Greeks, for the Greeks, it would be appalling. For the Romans, it would be efficient. It would make sense. So notice that the two attitudes are very different, right? So this is what Hadrian wanted to give to his people, right, was the Pantheon, a place for them to worship. And I think his love of Greece impacted the design to a great extent, but then he was also a Roman, so he was like, I want to be inventive. I want to do something different that's never been seen before. Eventually, as I mentioned again, all good things have to end. So after picking emperors, right, having that go along smoothly for a while in the High Empire, you reach the end of that line as well, where things start to get a little disputed and muddy and nasty, right, towards the end. And that leaves us with Commodus, right, to end off our discussion of the High Empire. Now, why show you Commodus? First off, look how great those beards have gotten, right? Great stuff. But I wanted you to think about the fact that when somebody is trying to take power that's not owed to them, how silly often their representations look. Because I can't look at this sculpture without wanting to laugh a little bit. Why is he doing this, though, in the sculpture? He's wearing the lion's skin because he's trying to convince you he's like Hercules, who killed a Nemean lion as part of his, feats, basically, the tasks of Hercules. But again, it just ends up looking silly and forced in a lot of ways. And Commodus, he tried to wrestle power away from people when he wasn't owed it. He was trying to break the rules. And so notice that you really can't stop corruption often within government. Sometimes it's out of your control. It's out of your hands. When someone like Commodus comes along, what are you supposed to do, you know? And so in a sense, he brings an end to this idea of the good emperors and the high empire. And that leads us into our discussion of the late empire, which is the dissolution and sort of slow decline of all things Roman. And there's a couple factors that play into this. So we'll dive into that in the last lecture.